The night my husband held up a paddle with the number 20 on it and pointed it at me like I was a piece of furniture, 300 people in that ballroom laughed. Champagne glasses clinked. Somebody's camera flashed. And I stood there in a $10,000 dress he'd picked out for me himself, smiling, because that's what I had trained myself to do for 11 years. Smile. Even when it feels like the floor is falling away beneath your heels. My name is Sarah Whitfield. I was 42 years old, married to a man named Richard Whitfield, a real estate developer whose name was on 3 buildings in the city and whose photograph hung in the lobby of the very hotel where this gala was happening. I want to tell you exactly how a man can spend 11 years convincing you that you're loved, and then, in front of everyone who matters to him, treat you like a party favor. And I want to tell you about the one guest in that room who didn't laugh. The one who stood up, walked to the front, and by the end of the night had taken apart my husband's entire empire, piece by piece, in front of the same crowd that had just watched him humiliate me. But to understand how we got to that ballroom, you have to understand how it started. Because nothing about that night was an accident. Nothing about Richard was ever an accident. I met Richard when I was 31. I was working as an interior designer for boutique hotels, the kind of job that paid well enough to be comfortable, but never let you forget you were still, in the eyes of people like him, the help. He hired my firm to redesign the lobby of a property he'd just acquired downtown, and he showed up to every single walkthrough personally, which the senior partners thought was strange for a man who owned 11 other buildings he never bothered to visit. I didn't think it was strange. I thought it was flattering. I thought it meant he cared about the details. It took me years to understand that Richard didn't care about the details of the lobby. He cared about the details of me. He was charming in that specific way self-made men often are, the kind of charm that isn't really about making you feel good, it's about making you feel chosen. He'd remember the name of my childhood dog. He'd send flowers not on my birthday, which anyone can remember, but on the anniversary of the day we first met, which nobody remembers unless they've written it down somewhere and built a strategy around it. I didn't know that then. I thought it was romance. Now I understand it was reconnaissance. We married 18 months after that lobby project ended. I gave up my design firm within 3 years, not because he asked me to outright, but because every project I took on somehow conflicted with a trip he'd planned, a gala he needed me to co-host, an investor dinner where he needed his wife present and radiant and free of any professional distraction. Slowly, the woman who used to argue with contractors about crown molding disappeared, and in her place was a woman whose entire identity was Richard Whitfield's wife. I want to be honest with you, for a long time I let that happen. I told myself it was a partnership. I told myself that supporting his ambition was its own kind of ambition. It took me a long time to admit that a partnership doesn't erase one person and leave the other standing. By the time I was 40, the Whitfield Foundation Gala had become the single biggest night on our social calendar, a black tie fundraiser Richard had built from nothing into the city's premier charity event, raising money for children's hospitals, though I'll get to exactly how much of that money actually reached any hospital a little later. Every year, I helped plan it. I chose the venue, the florals, the seating charts that could make or break real estate deals worth more than most people's houses. I was, in every functional sense, the operations manager of my own humiliation, and I didn't even know it yet. This past year's gala was supposed to be the biggest one ever. Richard had just closed on a waterfront development deal worth $200 million, and he wanted the gala to double as a celebration of that deal in front of every investor, city council member, and society reporter who mattered. He told me 3 weeks before the event that he wanted to add something new to the program, a bachelor and bachelorette auction segment, a lighthearted charity stunt where guests could bid real money, all going to the Children's Hospital Fund, to win a dance or a dinner date with one of several couples on the host committee. I should have felt something was wrong the moment he told me I would be one of the people up for auction. I remember asking him, half joking, "Are you sure you want to auction off your own wife, Richard?" And he laughed and said, "Sarah, it's for charity. Everyone will bid high just to be near you. You'll probably raise the most money of the night." He said it so smoothly, so warmly, that I actually believed I was being flattered. I did not know at that point that Richard had been having an affair with a woman named Vanessa Cole for the better part of 2 years. I did not know that Vanessa was the head of marketing for his development firm, and that she would also be attending the gala that night, seated not with her husband, because she didn't have one, but at a table close enough to the stage to have a perfect, unobstructed view. I did not know that Richard's real estate empire, the one plastered across magazine covers, was quietly hemorrhaging money from an over-leveraged development in Nevada that had gone sideways 8 months earlier. I did not know that the charity itself, the foundation with my husband's name on it, had been used as collateral for a private loan that most of our friends in that ballroom would have been horrified to learn about. I knew none of it. I only knew that I trusted him, and that trust, as it turns out, is the most expensive thing you can give a man who has already decided you're disposable. The night of the gala, I wore a deep emerald gown Richard had chosen from a designer in Soho, the kind of dress that costs more than most people's monthly rent and that I would never have picked for myself. He told me emerald brought out my eyes. I remember standing in front of the mirror in our hotel suite, and for one strange, quiet moment, I felt beautiful and cared for. I want you to hold on to that image, because it's the last time I felt that way in my marriage. The ballroom at the Ashford Grand was lit like something out of a film, hundreds of candles, an ice sculpture shaped like the Children's Hospital logo, a string quartet playing near the entrance. 312 guests, according to the final head count I would later request from the event coordinator, though I didn't know at the time why I would need that number. Politicians. Developers. Old money families who'd been writing checks to Richard's foundation for a decade. And near the back, at a table I hadn't personally arranged, sat a man I hadn't seen in 23 years. His name was Daniel Marsh. I'll tell you exactly who he was to me in a moment, but first, let me take you through the auction, because that's the part you came here for, and I owe you the truth of exactly how it happened. The auction segment started around 9:30, after dinner and before the dancing. The MC, a local news anchor Richard had hired for the evening, called each couple up to the small stage one at a time. There were 4 couples ahead of us. The bidding was playful, gentle, friends topping each other's offers, laughing, the kind of good-natured, competitive spending rich people do when they want an excuse to feel generous. $1,500 for a dinner date with the Hendersons. $2,000 for a dance with the Okafors. It felt warm. It felt like exactly what Richard had promised me, harmless, charitable fun. Then it was our turn. Richard walked me up to the stage himself, his hand at the small of my back, guiding me the way you'd guide someone who might otherwise wander off. The MC introduced us with the kind of flourish reserved for the hosts of the evening, and now, ladies and gentlemen, the reason we're all here tonight, Richard and Sarah Whitfield. Applause. I remember smiling out at the crowd, scanning faces I half recognized, still not understanding what was about to happen. The MC turned to Richard and, following the script we had apparently both agreed to weeks earlier, or that I thought we'd agreed to, asked him to say a few words about his wife before the bidding opened. And Richard, still smiling that television smile, took the microphone from the MC's hand. Sarah's been an incredible partner these past 11 years, he began, and the crowd made the soft, appreciative murmur crowds make. She's supported every deal, every late night, every crazy idea I've ever had. More warmth from the audience. I remember relaxing my shoulders slightly. And then he said, with a small laugh, the kind of laugh that tells a room a joke is coming, honestly, some nights I've wondered what kind of return I could actually get if I put her on the open market. The room laughed. I laughed too, because 11 years of training does not undo itself in 3 seconds, even when your stomach has just dropped through the floor. So Richard continued, turning to face the crowd directly, angling his body slightly away from me in a way I would replay in my mind 100 times afterward. Let's find out what she's really worth. Bidding starts at $500. Someone in the crowd, a business partner of his named Thomas Reyes, called out $500 almost immediately, clearly playing along with what everyone assumed was still the same charity game. A woman near the front raised it to $750. It felt, for about 90 seconds, like it might stay exactly what it was supposed to be, a joke that raised a few $1,000s for sick children and let everyone go back to their crab cakes. Then Richard did something I will never, for the rest of my life, be able to fully explain, except to say that some men cannot resist an audience, and some men have contempt for their wives so deep it only needs one open microphone to surface. He held up his own paddle, the one he was supposed to be using to acknowledge bids, not place them, and called out, loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear over the quartet, $20. Silence first. Then laughter, bigger laughter than before, the kind that ripples because people aren't sure if they should be shocked or delighted, and a room full of drunk, wealthy people will almost always choose delighted. $20 for my wife, he repeated, grinning, playing to the room like it was the best line he'd delivered all night. Come on, folks, I know her better than anyone here. 20 is generous. I stood there under the stage lights in the emerald dress he had chosen for me, holding a microphone I hadn't been given the chance to use, while my husband auctioned me off for the price of a parking ticket in front of everyone we knew. As a joke, he was clearly enjoying more than any deal he'd closed all year. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think a lot of people watching this have had a version of it, maybe not on a stage, maybe not in front of 300 people, but that exact feeling of being reduced, in a single sentence, to something small and disposable by the one person who was supposed to make you feel like the opposite. It doesn't feel like anger at first. It feels like falling. Like the floor of your whole life just quietly gives out, and you're still smiling because your face hasn't caught up to what your body already knows. And that is exactly when Daniel Marsh stood up. He was seated at table 14, near the back, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a gray suit that was expensive but understated in a way that told you he didn't need it to announce anything. I hadn't spoken to him in 23 years. I hadn't seen his face except in a handful of old photographs my mother kept in a shoebox she thought I didn't know about. Daniel Marsh was my biological father. He had left when I was 19, not the dramatic kind of leaving you see in movies, but the slow, administrative kind, a business trip that became a permanent relocation, a marriage to my mother that quietly dissolved into paperwork while I was away at college, a man who sent birthday cards for 2 years and then simply stopped. I grew up believing he'd left because he didn't want the complication of a grown daughter from a marriage he was already exiting. What I did not know, standing on that stage, was that Daniel Marsh had spent the last 2 decades building an investment firm worth just over $400 million, and that 6 months earlier, through channels I still don't fully understand, he had re-entered my life quietly, from a distance, watching. He hadn't come to that gala for the crab cakes. He had come because, 3 weeks earlier, his firm's due diligence team, the same team that vets every investment Marsh Capital makes, had flagged irregularities in the Whitfield Foundation's financial filings while evaluating an unrelated deal involving one of Richard's business partners. Daniel had recognized the name Whitfield instantly. He'd recognized it because he'd never stopped tracking, quietly, from a distance, what had happened to the daughter he'd left behind. He knew I'd married Richard 11 years ago. And when his analysts brought him a file suggesting the man I'd married was funneling charity donations into a personal investment fund to cover losses on a failed Nevada development, Daniel Marsh bought a ticket to the gala under his firm's corporate table. And he came to see for himself. He was planning, he told me later, to simply observe that night, to confirm what his team had found, quietly begin building a legal case with the state attorney general's charity oversight division, and find some private, careful way to reintroduce himself to me once he understood the full picture, so as not to upend my life without warning. That was the plan. The plan changed the moment Richard held up that paddle and said the words $20 into a live microphone in front of 300 witnesses. Daniel Marsh stood up from table 14, buttoned his suit jacket, and started walking toward the stage. The room, which had been mid-laugh at Richard's joke, slowly began to quiet as people noticed a stranger none of them recognized moving purposefully through the tables. I remember watching him approach and having no idea who he was. I remember thinking, distantly, through the fog of humiliation I was standing in, that he moved like a man who is used to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He reached the base of the stage, and instead of raising a paddle, he simply raised his voice. 25,000, he said. For the correct information about what's actually being sold here tonight. The room went dead silent. Richard's grin faltered for the first time all evening, not because of the number, though $25,000 is not a small sum, but because of the phrase, correct information, which is not a phrase auction guests use. The MC, flustered, tried to smooth it over. Well, that's a very generous bid, sir, for the dance with Mrs. Whitfield. I'm not bidding on a dance, Daniel said, and his voice, though calm, carried to every corner of that ballroom in a way that told me this man had spent decades in boardrooms learning exactly how to be heard. I'm bidding for 5 minutes at this microphone. And I'll donate the $25,000 to the Children's Hospital directly, not to the Whitfield Foundation account. Directly. Tonight. I have the wire transfer ready on my phone. I watched Richard's face change in real time. I had 11 years of practice reading that face, and I knew, before he did, that something in him had just gone cold with fear. I don't think this isn't really how the auction format works, Richard said, laughing again, but the laugh had a different texture now, thinner, forced. Then, let's change the format, Daniel said, and he simply walked up the 3 steps onto the stage, took the microphone from the MC's hand with a gentleness that somehow made it more unnerving than if he'd grabbed it, and turned to face the room. My name is Daniel Marsh, he began. Some of you know Marsh Capital. We manage about $400 million in assets, and part of what we do, before any investment, is exactly what we did before I walked into this ballroom tonight. We look very, very closely at the numbers behind the name on the building. He let that land. I saw Thomas Reyes, Richard's business partner, go pale near the front table. 3 weeks ago, Daniel continued, my analysts were reviewing a development partnership in Nevada that had recently defaulted on nearly $40 million in construction loans. In the course of that review, we found that 11 months ago, $600,000 from the Whitfield Foundation for Children's Health, a registered nonprofit, was transferred to a private holding entity called Meridian Bridge LLC. Meridian Bridge is wholly owned by Richard Whitfield. That $600,000 was then used to cover a margin call on the Nevada project so that Mr. Whitfield's personal real estate portfolio wouldn't take the loss the deal had already generated. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, money donated by many of you, believing it would go to sick children in this city, was used instead to protect one man's personal balance sheet. The room had gone from silent to something else, a low, rising murmur, the sound of 300 people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they knew about the evening. I'll say that number again so there's no confusion, Daniel said. $600,000. And that's just the transfer we found in 3 weeks of preliminary review. My firm has already forwarded our findings to the State Charity Oversight Division and to the Attorney General's office, as we're legally obligated to do when we uncover this kind of activity. I imagine there will be more numbers, and I imagine they will not be smaller. Richard tried to speak. This is completely unfounded. This man is clearly trying to, but Daniel simply continued, not raising his voice, which somehow made it worse for Richard than shouting would have. There's a second matter, Daniel said, and this one isn't about money. It's about the woman he just auctioned off for $20 in front of all of you. He turned, for the first time, to look directly at me, and something in his face softened in a way I had never seen from him, not once in 23 years, not even in the old photographs. Her name is Sarah. Some of you have known her for years as Richard's wife, the one who plans this gala, who chose these flowers, who has quietly built this event into what it is tonight. What most of you don't know is that for the last 2 years, while she was doing that work, her husband was involved in an ongoing relationship with a member of his executive team, a woman I believe is seated at table 6 tonight. Every head in that ballroom turned to table 6, where Vanessa Cole sat frozen, her wine glass halfway to her mouth, 300 pairs of eyes suddenly locked on her face. I want to pause here and tell you what that moment actually felt like from where I was standing, because it's not what you'd expect. I had just been publicly humiliated by my husband, and now I was watching that same husband's secret affair get exposed to the entire city in real time, and somehow, standing there in that emerald dress, I felt strangely calm. It was the calm of finally, after 11 years, watching the truth arrive in a room I could no longer be talked out of. I don't say this to humiliate anyone further, Daniel continued, and I believed him, because his eyes kept returning to mine, checking, the way you check on someone you're trying to protect. I say it because a man who will auction off his wife for $20 in public has already, in every way that matters, sold her a long time before tonight. I'm simply the first person in this room willing to say that out loud. He turned back to the crowd. So here's my offer. I'm donating $25,000 to the Children's Hospital tonight, directly, with documentation, so that at least one number from this event is honest. And I'm formally requesting, as a donor with a fiduciary concern, that the Whitfield Foundation's books be independently audited before another dollar is raised in its name. He set the microphone down gently on the podium stand, the way you'd set down something you didn't want to break, and walked off the stage without another word, leaving Richard standing there under the lights, next to me, in front of everyone. Before I tell you about the rest of that night, I want to back up for a moment, because there were warning signs long before the gala, and I think it's worth naming them, not to excuse myself for missing them, but because I know some of you watching this are living inside warning signs of your own right now, still telling yourselves the story I told myself for years. There was the time, 3 years into our marriage, when Richard joked in front of his college friends that he'd married me because I was low maintenance for someone who looks that expensive. Everyone laughed. I laughed. There was the time he introduced me at a business dinner as my better half, mostly because she's better at smiling through boring conversations than I am, and I remember the flicker of something cold in my chest that I quickly explained away as him being tired. Being stressed about a deal, not really meaning it. There was the gradual disappearance of my design clients, one by one, each time for a reason that sounded, in the moment, perfectly logical, a scheduling conflict, an investor dinner I needed to co-host, a trip he'd already booked before checking with me. I used to tell myself that a marriage is made of compromises, and that I was simply the more flexible partner. I didn't let myself use the word I now believe is more accurate, erased. Looking back, I think the paddle auction wasn't really a new behavior. It was an old behavior finally performed loudly enough, in front of enough people, that I could no longer tell myself it was something gentler than what it actually was. Richard had been auctioning me off in smaller ways for years. That night, he simply did it with a number attached, in a room bright enough that even I couldn't look away anymore. I won't pretend the rest of the night was calm. It wasn't. Within minutes, half the room was on their phones, some texting, some, I'd later learn, already calling lawyers or PR contacts. Thomas Reyes left within 10 minutes, and I found out 3 weeks later he'd been quietly cooperating with the Attorney General's investigation before he even left the parking lot, trying to distance himself before his own name got dragged into Richard's mess, since Thomas had signed off on some of the Meridian Bridge paperwork himself. Vanessa Cole left in tears, though I want to be clear I don't say that with any satisfaction. She was, in her own way, another person Richard had used and would go on to discard, and I heard secondhand, months later, that she'd been let go from the company within the month and had her own difficult road ahead untangling herself from what she'd been part of. Richard grabbed my arm as I stepped off the stage, his grip tighter than I'd ever felt it, his voice a hoarse whisper only I could hear. You knew about this. You set this up. And I remember looking at him, really looking at him, maybe for the first time in years, and saying, Richard, I didn't even know that man's last name until 4 minutes ago. Which was true. I had recognized his face somewhere in the fog of the last 20 minutes, some old, buried recognition clicking into place, but I hadn't understood yet who he was to me, only that he had just, for reasons I didn't understand, stepped into the worst moment of my life and refused to let it stay small. I found Daniel Marsh by the coat check 20 minutes later, already leaving, his car apparently called ahead. I stopped him with a hand on his sleeve, the same kind of instinctive gesture I imagine a much younger version of me might have used to stop a father from walking out a door. "Do I know you?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer, some part of my body recognizing something my mind hadn't caught up to yet, the shape of his jaw, maybe, or the particular way he tilted his head when he was choosing his next words carefully. "You used to," he said quietly. "A long time ago. I'm sorry it took me this long, and I'm sorry it happened like this, in front of everyone. That wasn't the plan. But I wasn't going to stand in that room and watch it happen to you twice." "Twice?" I asked. "Once, 23 years ago, when I left and made you feel like you weren't worth staying for," he said. "I've regretted that every year since, more than you probably believe is possible from a man who never called. And then tonight, watching that man hold up a paddle and call you $20, I wasn't going to let that be the second time in your life a man made you feel disposable while I did nothing. I won't pretend I forgave him in that coat check line. 23 years doesn't dissolve in a hallway conversation, and I told him that, honestly, and he nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer and respected it more for being honest. But I also didn't walk away. We exchanged numbers. And over the months that followed, through the divorce, through the unraveling of Richard's finances, through the slow, strange work of rebuilding a relationship with a father I'd spent 2 decades being angry at, Daniel Marsh became something I hadn't expected to have again in my life. Family, showing up not with an apology wrapped in a gift, but with an apology wrapped in action, which I've come to believe is the only kind that actually means anything. The fallout for Richard came fast, and it came from every direction at once, the way these things do once the first domino falls in public. The state attorney general's office opened a formal investigation into the Whitfield Foundation within a week, using Daniel's initial findings as a starting point and quickly uncovering more, not $600,000, as it turned out, but just over $1.4 million diverted from charitable funds into Richard's personal holdings over 3 years, some of it laundered through consulting fees to shell companies he controlled. The Nevada Development Partners, seeing the writing on the wall, moved to foreclose on the remaining assets rather than risk being associated with a fraud investigation. 2 of Richard's biggest institutional investors pulled out of a pending deal within the month, citing reputational concerns, which is the polished corporate way of saying nobody wanted their name near his anymore. The building with his name on the lobby quietly had that name removed 8 months later, replaced with the name of the firm that acquired it in a fire sale. There's one more scene from that period I want to tell you about, because I think it matters more than almost anything else that happened. About a month after the gala, before the divorce filing had even been finalized on paper, Richard showed up unannounced at the small rental apartment I'd moved into near the design studio I would soon relaunch. He stood in the doorway in a suit that no longer looked as commanding on him as it once had, and he didn't apologize. Not really, he explained. He told me the paddle had been a joke that got away from him, that he'd had too much champagne, that the crowd had egged him on, that I was choosing to believe a stranger's story over 11 years of marriage. For one long, quiet moment, standing in that doorway, I felt the old pull of it, the same pull that had kept me smiling through a decade of small erasures, the instinct to make his discomfort my responsibility to fix. And then I thought about Daniel Marsh walking calmly to that stage with nothing to gain, and I thought about how easy it would have been for him to simply stay seated at table 14 and let the moment pass, the way I had let 100 moments pass before it. I told Richard, as gently and as clearly as I could manage, that a joke doesn't require $600,000 of stolen charity money to land, and that I was done being the explanation for his choices. I closed the door. It was the last time I saw him outside of a courtroom. And I filed for divorce 11 days after the gala. Because of the state we lived in and the prenuptial agreement Richard's lawyers had drafted years earlier, an agreement I'd signed young and in love and never imagined I'd need to scrutinize, I wasn't automatically entitled to a large settlement. But once the charity fraud investigation became public, my attorney, a sharp, patient woman named Elena Cho, argued successfully that Richard's use of marital and foundation funds to cover his personal losses constituted financial misconduct significant enough to override several provisions of that agreement. It took 14 months. It was not simple, and it was not without moments where I doubted whether any of it was worth the exhaustion of fighting a man who had once known exactly how to make me feel small. But I want you to know that it ended with me walking away not just with a settlement that let me rebuild a life on my own terms, but with something I valued even more, the return of my name to my own designs. I relaunched my interior design firm 8 months after the gala, this time under my own name. No longer Richard Whitfield's wife, but simply Sarah Marsh, because somewhere in that year, I quietly took my father's name back, not out of anger toward the past, but because I wanted a name that belonged only to me and the family that had finally chosen to show up. Richard, as of the last I heard, pled guilty to 2 counts of charity fraud and 1 count of tax evasion, avoiding trial through a plea agreement that still resulted in 18 months in a minimum security facility and a lifetime ban from serving on the board of any registered nonprofit in the state. The company that once bore his name in gold letters across a downtown lobby now belongs, in majority share, to an investment group I understand my father was an early and significant investor in, though he has always been careful to tell me that particular acquisition wasn't about revenge. It was simply a good deal that happened to land on the right side of history. I believe him mostly. I also believe a small part of him enjoyed the poetry of it. People ask me sometimes now whether I hate Richard. I've thought about that question more than almost any other in the last 2 years, and the honest answer is that hate takes more energy than I'm willing to give him anymore. What I feel instead is something closer to clarity, the specific, quiet relief of finally seeing something exactly as it was, after years of convincing myself it was something else. Richard didn't become cruel the night he held up that paddle. He had always been capable of that cruelty. What changed that night wasn't him. It was that, for the first time, a room full of witnesses saw it too, and one of them refused to let it be laughed off as a joke. I think about that ballroom often, the candlelight, the ice sculpture slowly melting near the dessert table, the sound of 300 people laughing at a number that was supposed to represent my worth. And I think about the moment that laughter died, replaced by the sound of a man I hadn't seen in 23 years walking calmly to a stage to make sure the truth got said out loud, in a room full of people who mattered, on a night when it would have been so much easier for him to simply stay seated and let it pass. He didn't leave that night believing he'd fixed everything between us. He told me later he mostly expected me to never speak to him again, that he'd made peace with delivering the truth even if it cost him the daughter he'd only just found the courage to reach for. That, I think, is what actually broke through to me in the months that followed. Not the money, not the audit, not even Richard's downfall, but the fact that a man with nothing left to gain from me chose to stand up anyway. If there's a single thing I'd want anyone watching this to carry away with them, it's this. The people who truly value you don't need an audience to prove it. And the people who need an audience to humiliate you have already told you everything you need to know about how they see you, whether or not anyone else in the room is paying attention. I spent 11 years being quietly erased by a man who was very, very good at making that erasure look like devotion. It took one stranger, $25,000, and a microphone to remind an entire ballroom, and, finally, me of the difference between being chosen and being used. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why it took a public humiliation, a paddle held up like I was a piece of livestock, for me to finally see 11 years clearly. I've made peace with not fully understanding it. What I do know is that the woman who walked out of that ballroom that night in an emerald dress she didn't even like, on the arm of a father she was still learning how to trust, was already, in every way that mattered, worth more than any number that could ever be called out in a room. And she was only just beginning to find that out for herself.